In the last video, we looked at something uncomfortable, the way comfort itself can quietly become a kind of trap, not because anything went wrong, but because stability, over time, can close off as much as it protects. That idea tends to stay with people because it names something they already sensed, but couldn't quite articulate. And this episode is, in some ways, what comes next. Because once you've built a stable, comfortable, functional life, once everything is working the way it's supposed to, there's a specific thing that can happen. You can disappear from it. Not dramatically, not obviously. You keep waking up on time. You go to work. You handle your responsibilities. You show up for the people in your life. From the outside, you're functioning perfectly, but inside, you're not fully there. You move through your days. You complete tasks. You meet expectations. You're performing the actions of a life without actually feeling like you're living it. And the strange part is, no one else can tell, because you're good at functioning. But functioning isn't the same as living. And that gap, quiet as it is worth understanding.
Here's what this state actually feels like from the inside. You do things. You accomplish things. You complete what needs to be completed. But while you're doing them, you're not fully present. You're there physically. You're executing the task. You're saying the right things at the right moments. But there's a part of you watching from just slightly outside of it. Like you're a few inches behind your own eyes. It's not dissociation in any clinical sense. It's not numbness in the dramatic way people describe it. It's something quieter and more specific than that. It's automation. You've become so practiced at managing your life, so competent at its mechanics, that you can run it without actually inhabiting it. Think about how that happens with anything familiar. The drive you've taken 100 times, where you arrive and realize you don't remember the last 10 minutes. Your body handled it. Your mind was somewhere else, or nowhere. That's not a failure of the drive. The drive completed successfully. But you weren't there for it. Now extend that across a day, across a week, across several years. That's the split we're talking about. Between doing and being. Between performing your life and living it. And over time, that gap stops feeling like a gap. It just becomes the background tone of your days. There's a moment, and it's hard to identify when it happens, when life stops being something you experience and becomes something you manage. Tasks, responsibilities, obligations. You get good at it. You build systems, routines, efficient patterns that handle what needs handling. And that isn't pathological. That's competence. But there's a cost that rarely gets named. When life becomes a checklist, you stop noticing. Not in some philosophical sense. Literally, you stop lingering over things. You stop being surprised by small things. You stop allowing a moment to exist without immediately converting it into something to do or something to resolve. You move from one task to the next. At the end of the day, you've been productive. You've done what you needed to do. But if someone asked you what you actually experienced that day, not what you accomplished, but what you experienced, the answer is often surprisingly thin. You've been efficient, but efficiency and aliveness are not the same thing. Part of what drives this is structural, not personal. Modern life is organized around productivity as the default standard of value. Not just at work, everywhere. Rest becomes recovery, meaning it's acceptable only if it serves performance. Hobbies become self-improvement, meaning they need a return, a skill, an outcome. Relationships become something to maintain well, to invest in, to manage, to sustain. Even free time becomes something to use correctly. Everything has to justify itself, in functional terms. And when you fully internalize that framework, when it becomes the lens through which you evaluate your own moments, something specific gets lost. You lose the capacity to simply be. Not because you're incapable of it, but because being doesn't produce anything. Presence doesn't optimize. A moment that you simply inhabit, without converting it into something useful, starts to feel vaguely wrong, like you're wasting something. And so you stop lingering, you stop wandering, you stop allowing experiences to be complete in themselves. And in doing that consistently, over time, you lose something harder to name: the texture of lived experience. The difference between a life that happened and a life you were actually in. There's another shift that happens alongside this one, and it's even quieter. Responsibility gradually replaces desire as the organizing principle of your days. You do what needs to be done, what makes sense, what is expected of you, what would be irresponsible not to do. And responsibility is real. It matters. There's nothing wrong with it. But when it becomes the only operating logic, when want and responsibility stop being in conversation, something gets gradually displaced. Not suppressed, not denied, just deprioritized, again and again, until it fades. You stop checking in with what you actually want, not because the wants were wrong, but because there was never a good moment. And then the habit of not checking became the habit, and eventually the silence felt normal. The question that replaced it is simple: what needs to be done? And you answer it every day, until you realize you've been answering that question for years without ever asking the other one. That's not a dramatic collapse. It's a gradual substitution. And what it produces is a life that runs well, but doesn't feel like yours. When you're functioning but not living, you also become very good at performing normalcy. You show up, you engage, you say the right things at the right moments. You laugh when laughing is appropriate. You express interest when interest is expected. You participate. From the outside, everything looks fine. Often it looks better than fine. But internally, you're a step removed from it. What makes this particular kind of exhausting is that it involves a constant secondary layer of self-monitoring. You're not just living, you're watching yourself live, making sure it reads correctly. That quiet management of how you appear, running in the background of every interaction, is its own kind of labor. Not dramatic, invisible, cumulative. And it takes energy in a way that's difficult to account for, because there's nothing specific to point to. You didn't have a hard day. You just managed yourself continuously through a day that looked perfectly ordinary. This state is often mistaken for depression, including by the people experiencing it. But it's worth being precise about the difference, because conflating them misses what's actually happening. Depression, in its clinical sense, collapses function. It makes even simple tasks feel impossible. It pulls the floor out. This is different. You're still capable, still productive, still showing up, still considered reliable by everyone around you. The problem isn't that you can't do things. It's that doing things doesn't feel like anything. You're competent, but absent. Functional, but not present. Running, but not alive. The machinery works. The experience has gone quiet. And if you approach this as a malfunction, as something to fix or correct, you end up applying solutions to a problem that hasn't been properly identified. This isn't a broken system. It's a system that has optimized itself at the expense of the person inside it. One of the things that disappears earliest and most quietly is spontaneity. Not because you became rigid or controlled, but because spontaneity is structurally incompatible with managed lives. It's unpredictable, it's inefficient. It creates outcomes you didn't plan for. So gradually, without deciding to, you stop leaving room for it. You plan, you optimize, you build routines that work. And routines do work. They reduce friction, they free up cognitive space. But they also, if they become total, remove the conditions under which surprise is even possible. And surprise is not trivial. Surprise is how life signals its own aliveness, the unplanned conversation, the moment that turns out to mean something you couldn't have scheduled, the experience that had no purpose and for that reason stayed with you. In a fully managed life, those moments stop arriving. Not because you blocked them, because there was no space left for them to land. What underlies much of this is the slow replacement of experience by efficiency. You optimize outcomes instead of inhabiting moments. You're always moving toward what's next, the next task, the next obligation, the next item on the list. And that orientation means you're never fully where you are. This isn't restlessness in the anxious sense. It's a kind of trained temporal displacement. You've learned to live slightly ahead of the present moment, planning it, managing it, moving through it. And the cost of living slightly ahead is that you're never quite here. An afternoon that goes well by every external measure. You did what needed doing. You were where you were supposed to be. Can still feel, at the end of it, somehow unlived. Not wasted, just not inhabited. That distinction matters. When a life is organized entirely around function, something happens to meaning. It doesn't disappear suddenly. It erodes, quietly. And in the same way paint fades on a wall, gradually enough that you don't notice until one day the color is gone and you can't say when it left. Because meaning doesn't come from completing tasks. It comes from lived experience, from presence, from the felt sense that you are actually in your own life. And when life becomes management, that felt sense slowly vacates. You're doing everything correctly. You're meeting every standard. You're producing the right outcomes. But somewhere along the way, you stopped knowing why. Not philosophically, not in the crisis sense. Just the why receded, and the doing continued anyway. Because the doing had its own momentum, and that momentum didn't require meaning to continue. That's the quiet collapse. Not a breakdown, not a crisis. Just a life that kept running, after the experience of living had quietly stepped out. This is something the next part of this arc is going to look at directly. What happens when that quiet erosion goes unnoticed long enough that it starts to feel like the natural texture of life? That's a different kind of problem, and it's worth understanding on its own terms. If you're functioning but not living, it means something specific has happened. Not that you failed, not that something is broken in you, but that over time, performance replaced presence, management replaced experience, responsibility crowded out desire, efficiency became the default mode of being. And when all of that happens gradually enough, you end up with a life that works, that is, by most measures, successful, and that you are, in some essential way, missing. That state has a logic to it. It didn't happen randomly. It happened because you were functioning the way you were supposed to function, inside a framework that rewards functioning above almost everything else. Recognizing that isn't a diagnosis. It's a clarification. So, if your life is running smoothly, but you're not really in it, if you can account for every day but can't quite say what you experienced, if you show up correctly but feel, underneath it, vaguely absent, then you haven't failed. You've become very good at managing your life. So good, over so long, that the management replaced the living. And that replacement is quiet enough that it can go unnoticed for years, until it can't. The previous video in this series looked at how comfort quietly becomes a trap. If you haven't seen it, it's linked in the description. What we've been circling in these last 2 episodes is a particular kind of loss, not loud, not acute, not dramatic, but real. And in the next video, we're going to look at what happens when this kind of absence, this quiet drift from one's own life, starts to affect not just how you feel, but what things mean, or stop meaning. That's where this leads, and it's worth looking at directly.